Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, students, whenever you are watching this video. This should be my last, content video for a hot second, because this is the last sort of big change in the AP Macroeconomics curriculum for the 2022-2023 school year. In our CED, which is the course exam description that we get from College Board that sort of explains what stuff you're going to get asked about. This was the thing they added this year, which is typically it's called the reserve market. That we saw was like, oh, that's actually brand new. In previous videos that are part of this series that I've had to do updates over, I mentioned some things like ample and limited reserves and how that's new. This is the sort of big concept they were pushing for in the new sort of graph, frankly, that they're pushing for us to understand based off of that new content. Those of you that are wondering, students, why is there new content? Because the world changed a bit. Now, this actually wasn't a result of the pandemic. This is something from before then, the financial crisis back in 2008, the big recession before the 2021, the 2008 one, where we may have done some things in terms of how we fixed the economy after that, that kind of reframed how we understand the economy to actually work. And things that we thought were true ended up being kind of wrong, which is always fun to find that you were wrong about a thing. So, the new content is the reserve market. We're going to start that here in a second. So here we go. This, to be clear for any of you watching the video, if you're a new student taking this class for the first time, yeah, it's a new graph. There frankly isn't that much they can ask with it. It is kind of a complicated one though, so buckle up. Okay. Oh, and also if you're one of my students and you're watching this, no, this won't be on the Unit 4 test. In case you were wondering. But we're still going to learn it because it could be on your AP exam, so we're going to cover it. Alright, here we go. Button. The new graph. The reserve market. So, what's happening? Why? Why do we have to do a new graph? Why, McRitchie? Why is there another graph? Why did they add more to our content? If you're a teacher watching this, why give us more to cover? So, here's the reasoning as to why this graph exists and to why we've had to change things in the sort of what went wrong. The money market graph that you have already learned in Unit 4, vertical money supply, downward sloping demand of money, monetary policy affects the money supply thing. That is a simplification of how our economy works. It is what it used to be like. Pre-2008, the Fed had really primarily three monetary policy tools they messed with, which were the reserve requirement, the discount rate, and open market operations, which was their go-to, the buying and selling government bonds by the Federal Reserve. Those were sort of the three things they did, and it affected interest rates by moving the money supply, as you guys have seen so far in Unit 4, right? The change in the money supply affects interest rates. Cool? So, in my class, we have already covered this. If you're watching another class and they haven't mentioned this, there are two types of economies that we have sort of figured out existed. To be clear, we did not know this was true until post-2008 financial crisis. That you can have an economy that has what's called limited reserves. Limited reserves meaning the amount of money in the banking system is fairly limited. There is a pretty strong cap on it. It can't go past a certain point. Banks don't have infinite money functionally and have to make really strong choices about what they can do with that money. And they actually have to hold on to some of it, right? The reserve requirement kicks into play, and countries and banks, have to hold on to a portion of your deposit. It's the fractional reserve banking system, right? What we found out in 2008 is that you can actually have what are called ample reserves, which just means your economy has kind of too much money in the banking system. That doesn't necessarily mean the people have too much money, to be clear, because you might think too much money in the banking system means that we are storing too much money in banks. No, we mean literally the banks themselves as businesses may have gotten a bit too much money on their hands, partially being incredibly successful in making money, which is good for them, but from a Federal Reserve standpoint is we kind of didn't anticipate banks being this profitable. But mostly because of actions taken by the central bank and the government of the United States in the post-2008. Just to give you the shortest version possible of this, big recession in 2008, we do a bunch of expansionary policies to try to fix this. We bail out a bunch of banks and financial institutions because based off of frankly, choices that they had made that kind of put them in this situation. They were going to go out of business. The problem with that being, lots of people have their money in those banks. Lots of people put the money in those financial institutions, and a lot of jobs are tied up in that. So a bank going under could cause job losses in the tens of thousands. And if we can avoid that, we would prefer to. But in avoiding that, we kind of created a new problem, because that's just how economics works. There is nothing that is truly free. Everything has a cost. The cost is our framework of how the economy works. We kind of messed it up, which is funny. In that we had to adjust things. And to be clear, it doesn't mean that we're all like going to be poor and broken now. No. It just means that things that used to work before don't work now. We had to figure things out, and we're kind of in the we figured it out window of time, which is why we're now teaching about it, because I think we have a better understanding of how this works in the real world. Okay. A lot of background, I know, but it's real world stuff, and this is a real world class, so why wouldn't I explain what actually happened? Okay. Remember, moving over here, ample and limited reserves. Again, in my class, we've already covered this, so shouldn't be news to you in my class, but if you're not in my class and your teacher hasn't covered this, well, here you go. Limited reserves, there's a limited amount of money in banking reserves, okay? All of your monetary policy tools that you've learned work. Because they all affect quantity. They all affect the amount of money banks have, right? In our class, we did like these flow charts. In my videos, we see these flow charts of banks have more money, so they can lend out more, so interest rates go down for expansionary monetary policy, right? Whether that be lowering the discount rate or the reserve requirement or buying bonds, yeah. Because it always ended up with banks having more or less money, which then changed the interest rates, which is like how monetary policy affects the economy, is by changing interest rates. Cool? Ample reserves. Banks have too much money now. Kind of, when I say too much, it is they have such a large amount that just simply changing like how much they have is kind of negligible to an extent. The same way that if I take, $1 million away from a multi-billionaire, it doesn't really change their behavior very much. We're kind of in that realm with banks, where banks have been given too much money so that the things that we were normally doing that were changing quantity do not change quantity by a substantial enough amount that it actually matters. That's kind of the issue we have. The buying bonds thing, we can't buy trillions of dollars of bonds. One, the Fed doesn't have that money. Two, if they were to do that, that could honestly make the problem worse in terms of that much money flowing into our economy could drastically drive up our spending to the point of causing a massive spike of inflation. So we can't just do quantity-based anymore. We have to do what are called interest-based monetary policies. The sort of go-to for this, in case you're wondering, is administered interest rates as a whole, just in general. If you're looking for the specifics, we mentioned in the class, the discount rate and the interest on reserve balance, or the IOR rate for short. Those are your administered interest rates. So changing those work because those actually have a direct correlation to overall interest rates. While there is a quantity-based domino effect that can happen, as you will see on this graph, there is actually a more direct change to interest rates that happen with those two. Didn't explain that when we covered those policies the first time because I think this graph actually does help you understand that better. So I was like, I'll push pause on explaining how those ones really affect interest rates directly. We'll talk more about that later. Here is the later. This is where we get to like the more complicated part. So, things to know. Here's some just vocab that will help you understand the graph, okay? The big ones that are highlighted are the new ones, really. The ones that we haven't probably defined in my class. You might have, if you're someone else taking this class, define this. We haven't specified these terms in this way. We've said them, but not necessarily with this vocabulary. So, the big one to know is what's called the policy rate, okay? This is also referred to as the target rate. When we say the Federal Reserve is trying to raise or lower interest rates via monetary policy, again, expansionary, you're trying to lower them to get more spending. Contractionary, you're trying to raise them to get less. What we're talking about is the policy rate. That is the interest rate that they are specifically targeting. What that interest rate is the bank-to-bank loan rate. The federal funds rate is what it's called in America when Chase, a commercial bank that a lot of my students have an account with, and Wells Fargo, ditto, a commercial bank my students have a lot of accounts with, lend and borrow from each other, right? We mentioned that overnight loans exist, that banks might, over the course of a business day, lend out a bit too much, and just to sort of cover their bases, to have enough money to make sure that they can, do their day-to-day business operations, might have to borrow from a buddy, right? Might have to borrow from somebody else. The price they pay when they borrow from each other is the federal funds rate, which is the general term for that is the policy rate. Every country calls it the policy rate. America calls it the federal funds rate, much like the central bank is the global term for what the Federal Reserve is. The Federal Reserve is an example of a central bank. The federal funds rate is an example of a policy rate. Why this matters is because this ends up being indicative of what happens to interest rates as a whole. If banks are charging them this, it's going to affect every other interest rate that a bank controls. The interest rate that they charge you for when you lend out, as well as what's called the deposit rate, which is over here. The deposit rate is the interest rate that banks pay you when you store your money there. So when you have a savings account at a bank and you store your money there, what they are paying you in interest is called the deposit rate. Okay? You should know that one because that is a primary cost, an input cost for banks, right? If we're thinking of things that make banks profit versus things that count as an overall loss for them, the deposit rate is what would be an overall loss for them, because if the deposit rate would be higher, then banks would be paying you more money to store money there, which would incentivize your saving, but would also cost the banks money, which banks aren't very fond of that. So the deposit rate tends to be pretty low, which you'll see in a second. So when we say the federal funds rate is changing, or the policy rate, which is how it appears in the AP exam most of the time, is they're saying the word policy rate, which is why I have that as the term. When we say the policy rate is changing, be aware that you can substitute interest rates, as you've seen on your money market graph in there. Because if that's happening to the policy rate, can guarantee it's happening to interest rates as a whole. So if they say policy rates are going down, you could interpret that the same as you would interpret interest rates in general going down. So higher investment spending, higher aggregate demand. I've also redefined terms you should already have in your notes. Reserves being just the amount of money that's in the banking system in general. Okay, so we say the reserve market is the market for just money in the banking system in a kind of period. Similar to supply of loans on your loanable funds market graph, but this isn't necessarily tied to lending. This is just tied to the fact that they have it, period, and the variety of things they can do with it. The discount rate, which is the price of a loan from the Fed to a commercial bank. Mentioning here specifically, in the last handful of years, this has effectively acted as the most a bank is willing to pay for a loan, right? I can borrow from the Fed at this price, or I can borrow from another bank at another price. I'm going to pick whichever is cheaper. So the discount rate kind of acts as the ceiling on that price. I'll show you in a sec what I mean by that. And the IOR, or IORB rate, which is the interest rate on reserve balances, is what the Fed pays when banks deposit money at the Fed. And this is a newer monetary policy. This was created back in 2008 and is part of the reason why this problem started. But it's also a way to actually adjust the economy as a result of it. So it is a double-edged sword in the creation of the IOR rate. So banks, commercial banks like Wells Fargo and Chase can save money at the Fed, just like I could save money at Chase or Wells Fargo, and they get paid interest. Cool. Guaranteed rate of return. Nice, easy way for banks to make money. All right. Here we go with the new graph. Look at this bad boy. This is a weird-looking graph, gang. Let me make myself a little smaller so you can read all the text. This says, as you should draw it. When you're drawing this on an FRQ, I took this straight from an FRQ on the AP exam. This is what it should look like. The only thing that I would say that they kind of don't have on their drawing, which they should, they're dumb for not having it, is there should be QRE here for quantity of reserves at equilibrium. So if I'm doing this on my AP exam, I'm labeling that. Only because we label equilibriums on our graphs. And for some reason, this one didn't have it when I saw theirs, which I thought was kind of odd. I assumed they just had a brain fart. If they don't need it, awesome. But I'm always going to write equilibrium because why wouldn't I do that? So I know it looks weird. Just draw it. Just draw it real fast. Just have it drawn. And I'll walk you through what's happening. Okay. So we've got the supply of reserves, which is that supply curve. Cool. The overall supply of money that's in the banking system. Again, That's not tied to interest rates. That's just like the amount of money that is there presently. So vertical line, kind of like the money supply was, where it's just, there's just this amount that exists. This isn't their willingness or ability to lend. This is just how much money do they have, period. So vertical line is just how much they say. So if that's, $5 trillion of total reserves, I mean, that's a lot, but there's my supply. Okay, we've got the y-axis here being the policy rate. That's why you had to define it, because it's important. So the federal funds rate in America, policy rate in general, is your y-axis. Quantity is always my x-axis on a supply and demand graph, so it's just quantity of reserves. The demand curve is the, what the hell's going on with this graph, part of the graph for my students, right? If I'm a student in this class and I haven't seen any weirder advanced econ graphs, which for the love of God, if your teachers are showing you that, I don't know why. It's just traumatizing. This looks odd because this is not a normal looking demand curve as you guys have understood it. All of the demand curves you've seen so far just look like this portion right here. It just look like that, right? This one's got this weird horizontal part at the top and at the bottom. Okay, we'll explain that. We'll get there. So the demand curve there is the demand for reserves, basically what is the bank's overall desire to have money at hand, on hand, right? The thing you've got to know when drawing this graph is that setting up this graph will work similarly to when you draw an aggregate demand, aggregate supply curve with LRAS. In that, when you draw this graph, where I position the supply curve at the start matters. Where I drew LRAS on my ADAS graph told me if the economy was at full employment or if they were in a positive or a negative output gap, right? Where I draw this supply curve tells me if this economy has limited or ample reserves. Here is why. Okay? Those quantity-based theories, right? I'm going to make myself bigger to explain this. Okay. Those quantity-based theories that we were looking at before, the old monetary policy tools that worked all the time, reserve requirement, OMOs, all of those, right? Those changed the money supply, which changed interest rates, right? Changing the supply changed interest rates. That was how our money market graph worked. Okay. If this supply curve is here, where it is right now, if I move the supply curve to the right, like that, if I increase the money supply, if I increase the amount of money in the banking system, like that, does that change the policy rate? Look at your equilibrium. This, where these two lines meet, is my initial equilibrium. That's why they label this. The PR1 should be, I would label it PRE, personal preference, but AP exam would be fine with either. So that equilibrium initial was there, and now it's here. Did the policy rate change when I increased the supply curve? No. Right, because when we talk about an economy with ample reserves, changing the supply doesn't really change interest rates. So if I'm starting SR, my supply of reserves, down here along this lower horizontal portion is what we're saying, okay? If I'm drawing that down there, then moving that supply curve to the right or left, a reasonable amount, not but left, right, a little bit, is not going to change my policy rate. It's not going to change interest rates, which means that's the ample reserves portion. So basically, I'm going to make it a little. This pen thing is not the best tool, but it is a free one, so that's why I use it. So I apologize if you would like this tool to be much better, but I'm going to try to do my best here. Effectively, this, oh wow, that covers up everything. I kind of want that to be transparent. Can I make a highlighter? Aha, I can. So, this portion of the graph, that area, if my supply curve is drawn in this chunk, effectively past the downward sloping part, along this lower horizontal portion, I'm in ample reserves territory. Okay? That area is like ample reserves territory because changing the supply curve in that area, moving it left and right, as long as it stays in that area, it doesn't change interest rates. Why? Because we have too much money in the banking system. We have gone past the point of no return, that point being here. Okay? That's sort of the part of this graph that delineates or differentiates between your ample and your limited reserves. If you are here, if you are in the, what I would call normal looking portion of the graph, where our demand curve is downward sloping, If my supply curve was drawn there, I would have limited reserves. When I say this, what I mean to say is, just like with your LRAS, I can draw a POG or a NOG, is how I call it in class, a positive or a negative output gap or full employment. I can, by where I started the supply of reserves, tell someone what this economy is going through. If I draw it on the lower portion, it's got ample reserves, which is what it says right here. When an ample reserves, the supply of reserves should be intersecting on the lower horizontal portion, so I get down there. If the intersection happens on the downward sloping portion of DR, that'd be limited reserves. Because if I'm on that downward sloping portion and I move the supply curve to the right or the left, that would then change interest rates like it does on your money market graph. So in those situations, things like buying bonds, when I'm in limited reserves, would affect interest rates because it would move my supply curve to the left or right and change my equilibrium. If I'm in ample reserves, and I say buy bonds, increases money supply, would increase the supply of reserves, because if banks have more money, then banks have more money, which is cool, but doesn't actually change anything. And this was the problem that we found out about in 2009 and onward, was that the Fed kept doing the buying bonds thing to try to get us to spend more, and nothing happened to interest rates. And we were like, what the absolute hell is happening? Why aren't interest rates changing? Why isn't it working? Now is the time to explain that. So, before we do anything else, let me just make sure we understand this first part of the graph, which is drawing and labeling it. There is this weird zig, I'll explain that in a second, where I draw the supply curve. If I draw it on the lower portion, we're in ample. If I draw it on the downward sloping portion, like there, we're in limited, okay? As far as I've seen it, they almost only have you draw this graph with ample reserves. I actually haven't seen them have you draw it with limited, but I could see a multiple choice question being like, hey, look at this reserve market graph, and it's like, here. What can I say is going on in this economy? And I could say that it has limited reserves. So I could see that being a possibility. Okay, so let's explain this graph. To be clear, when you draw in the AP exam, this is what you should draw. Outside of, I would label this QRE, and I'd probably label that PRE for myself. It's just personal preference. But this is how you label it. This is the version I grabbed from a textbook. So what I'm going to do here is do my best to explain why we have this upper and lower bound, why there is effectively these are, in practical graph terms, asymptotes. These are spots that this graph technically shouldn't be touching, but AP exam doesn't want to make you have to graph difficult drawings, so they're letting you just get away with drawing it on the line. So let me explain this. So this is how it's looked on a textbook where I kind of saw it the first time. Quantity of reserves still, policy rates still, supply and demand of reserves. These dotted lines, don't get overwhelmed, okay? It's very scary to see this many things labeled on a graph. You don't label it like this. You label it like this, which isn't that crazy. This is just to explain stuff, okay? So, let's go through this. I'm going to make myself as big as possible so that I can really get your attention, so that I can try to explain what's happening on this graph to you. Disclaimer, I haven't taught this before. This is new. I taught this to my student teacher and to a couple other teachers in my department who are teaching this in other schools in my district. So they seem to understand it, so I think I'm doing an okay job. But if you're like, this is a lot, on the AP exam, I don't expect them to ask you to understand this level of it, but if you're wanting to know why that demand curve is zigzag like that, here is the explanation. So, okay, everybody just breathe for a second. All right. So, banks, right? Commercial banks. So we're talking about with this graph primarily, okay? They have two very straightforward ways of making money with their excess reserves, okay? The obvious one that you guys are aware of already, I think, is lending, right? Where they can lend money to you and make money off of that, right? We already knew that, right? Banks can lend. That's kind of like the whole point, is that you can get a loan from them. It's like the main function they serve, okay? So banks can lend money. Fantastic, right? Cool. They can also make money now, this is a newer thing, by saving their money at the Federal Reserve, right? They can borrow, or they can lend, and they can save. There's two functions where banks can make money, right? They can save their money in the Federal Reserve, earn interest off of that IOR rate we've talked about before, or they can lend money to us or to each other. That's where the policy rate kicks in, is that when banks lend to each other, right? They can lend money and make money off of that. So there's two ways banks can make money. With me? Okay. So let's start with the lending one. Cool? So the discount rate, we mentioned, is the price of a loan from the Federal Reserve to a commercial bank. Okay. Well, let's talk about the discount rate in relationship to this y-axis, the policy rate, the federal funds rate, right? If I'm a bank, if I'm Chase Bank, right, and I need to borrow money quickly for an overnight loan to get money fast so that I can cover withdrawals the next business day, right? I have two options. I can borrow from the Federal Reserve and pay that discount rate, or I can borrow from another bank, like Wells Fargo, or Bank of America, or whatever bank you use, insert commercial bank here, okay? Borrow from them and pay back the policy rate, that federal funds rate. Again, policy rate equals federal funds rate, the same thing, okay? So here's the trick. If I'm borrowing, who am I going to be borrowing from? Who would I borrow from? Well, if I have to pay back the loan, I would want to borrow from whoever's offering it at a lower price, right? Wherever it's cheaper to borrow. Like if I imagine I'm driving, on my way home from work, and I'm driving past a couple gas stations, where should I fill up? Wherever it's cheaper, right? I drive past a Shell, I drive past a 7-Eleven, I drive past a QT, all of these on the way home. Which one should I fill up at? Wherever it's cheapest, right? So, if we're thinking logically here, banks themselves are like setting that, policy rate. They're setting what they would charge another bank to borrow. Like Wells Fargo, if they're the one lending to Chase in our example, sets the price of that. Would they set that price higher or lower than the discount rate? Well, if the discount rate's the price of a loan from the Fed to a commercial bank, and I'm Chase and I need a loan, I'm not paying more than that for a loan. I know I can get it, say it's 5%. I know I can get a loan from the Federal Reserve for 5%. Guaranteed. I know that's a safe bet because the Federal Reserve has functionally infinite money because they control the mint, right? If I need a loan, I can go to them for 5%. So if you're Wells Fargo, you can't charge more than 5% for that loan because no one would borrow from you, okay? Earlier in this class, when you first learned about the discount rate, it was told that discount rate, the name of it came because it was cheaper than the federal funds rate. That was true for a time. But when the ample reserves shift happened and the reserve requirement stopped mattering, then the Fed knowing that I need to borrow thing is no longer a stressful thing for me because the only way that I got in trouble was if I didn't maintain my required reserves as a bank. But the reserve requirement doesn't exist anymore. So there is no risk to me borrowing from the Fed. There is no government watching over my shoulder bit because they have nothing to watch for. I am allowed to lend out every dollar possible, so why would you care? Which is accurate, to be clear. So banks have to now charge less than the discount rate if they want to be able to lend to each other. Otherwise, you would just borrow from the Fed. So because of that, the discount rate acts as an upper boundary. This line will never go past the discount rate because banks cannot functionally charge each other more than what the Fed is charging because they literally wouldn't be able to make the deal happen. It would be if I'm driving home and Shell's got gas for $2.50 and QT's got gas for $3 a gallon. I'm never stopping at QT. I'm only stopping at Shell. If they're close, maybe I'll do a bit of both. But I'm going to pick the one that's lower. So if I am a bank trying to make a loan, which is how I make money, I need to charge less than the discount rate to make money. So that's like an upper boundary. Practical terms, functions as an asymptote. It could be equal to the discount rate. That is technically fine because then it's just pick and choose which one you want. So it's fine if it is equal to the discount rate. So it's not like never touch it. So that's why you can draw it intersecting. It's okay if it touches it. But it's never going past that. It's a cap. It's a ceiling on that price. Okay? That's the upper boundary. Normal looking demand curve. I don't think I need to explain a normal looking demand curve. Okay? At higher interest rates, banks wouldn't want to have much in their reserves. They'd rather save it. At lower interest rates, banks would not want to have very much in their reserves. They wouldn't want to be saving it. So the IOR rate. That acts as the functional dip on this. This drawing from a textbook technically has there being like two things here. On this graph, this is the IOR rate functionally. Like the IOR rate is going to act as your lower boundary on this graph. This is just to be like the, perfect world, explain every detail that you might see in like an advanced econ textbook. So I'll explain this part. For you guys, all you got to really get is the IOR part of this. So here's the deal. Okay? Remember, banks have two ways of making money. Lending, saving at the Fed. Cool? Okay. If I know the Fed's offering me 2% interest on savings, right? As a bank, I've mentioned before, that's basically a zero risk proposition. That I can store money at the Fed and I'm guaranteed that money. They're good for it, no risk, right? It's not being lent anywhere. I don't have to worry about somebody paying me back. The Fed's just holding on to it for me and giving me money for it, which is sick, right? As a bank, that's awesome. I love that. So, if I'm a bank and my two ways of making money are save at the Fed for zero risk and lending it, cool? For me to even think about lending money, I need to be making more off of lending than I would off of saving, right? If they're equal propositions, as I guess fine, I could pick and choose which one I would want to do, but I would never lend at a lower interest rate than I can make in savings at the Fed, right? Because if those are my two ways of making money, well, I'm guaranteed 2% at the Fed. So I'm never charging less than 2% for a loan, because otherwise I'm making less profit than I would make from just saving at the Federal Reserve. Doesn't make much sense for me. So, if I'm a bank, I need to lend at a higher price than that IOR rate, because that effectively acts as like a floor, like a bare minimum amount of money that I can be making is the IOR rate, which is why it's the like lower bound part of this, is that they ain't charging less than that, because they're gonna make that money at least if they save it at the Fed, okay? So they have to charge more to make more profit, and again, banks are a business, so they're gonna charge based off the ability to make a profit. So, this graph, that upper boundary line is the discount rate, because banks won't ever charge more than discount rate because they won't be able to, no one will buy from them, no one will borrow from them if they charge more than that. And this lower bound is the IOR rate, because again, if I'm a bank, I guarantee that return by saving it at the Fed. If I don't charge more than that, then I'm not making profit. So why would I do it? Okay, so the words that are hidden by my giant head. This is just to explain the thing we were mentioning. This is how the ample reserves portion of the graph looks. Supply curve is drawn over here. Changes in the supply curve do not really change the policy rate, or if they do, it's by a tiny baby amount that doesn't do anything. The IOR rate we've already talked about, okay? Just in case you want to know why the deposit rate is down here, I'll explain this. AP exam doesn't care about it, but like some of you guys like economics. The deposit rate is the asymptote. Like the IOR rate, again, it's technically okay if it's equal. Like you could conceivably charge as much for a loan as you could get on savings, because like then it's equal return, which is I guess fine. Like it's still it's better to save it at the Fed because it's a more guarantee that you're getting that money back. But it like price wise, like profit wise, you're making the same amount of profit. So that's why it could equal. The deposit rate, it ain't going below that. Right, the deposit rate is how much they're paying you. Like you as in you, the person, not you, a bank. Like literally you, when you save your money at a bank, Chase, Wells Fargo, how much they're paying you in interest for that savings account, okay? They are not paying you more than they make in profit from the Federal Reserve, from each other, okay? So the deposit rate will always be lower than everything else on here, because otherwise banks would be operating at a loss, which is not happening. Banks are not doing that. They're not going to purposely take an L like that. So the deposit rate is the full bottom line asymptote. It's not touching that. Okay, which the cool thing is means when I'm shifting this graph, it will also affect that rate. It'll affect the deposit rate too, because I can get further away or move that asymptote up and down. It can make things different. So let's look at that. So, just in case you wanted a visual of it, if this was the limited reserves deal, right? We've got the discount rate, we've got the deposit or IOR rate down here, right? You've got that supply curve is now on the downward sloping portion because we are in limited reserves. Ooh, well, crazy. Which just makes this graph behave a lot like the money market, where if I move the supply curve to the left, I get higher interest rates. If I move the supply curve to the right, I get lower interest rates. Ain't that big of a deal. This target rate, to be clear, is that policy rate at equilibrium. Like, the target rate that they're setting is the rate they're trying to get interest rates to. So when we say like IRE on your money market graph, like, you can conceivably think of that as like a target. Like, that's sort of their goal. When they say the Fed is targeting a higher or lower interest rate, to be specific, they're talking about the federal funds rate. Okay, shifting the graph. Because it's a graph, so like the big thing you gotta know is like, how do I change this thing, right? Supply curve. We've already mentioned this. This is just where you start the graph, okay? Where do I start it is if it's ample or limited reserves. If it's limited, treat it like it's money market. Draw it on the downward sloping portion of the graph, and honestly, the graph will behave just like the money market does, at least where it comes with a supply curve. Monetary policy, expand and contract. Move the supply to the right or the left. Nothing too crazy. If it's ample reserves, your supply curve is going to be on that bottom horizontal line, where that IOR rate's at. You're going to be down there. The demand curve shift. I don't have this highlighted. I don't know why, to be honest. But this is the big one. Like, you will actually not shift the supply curve, as far as I can tell in looking at practice problems. You will not be shifting that supply curve very often. You might draw it in a different starting spot, but you're not really shifting it very often. What you are changing is the demand curve. And the reason why is because of that upper and lower boundary thing. If the upper and lower boundaries are the discount rate and the IOR rate, guys, we have done problems where we changed those, where we literally raised or lowered the discount rate or raised or lowered the IOR rate. Well, if those are the boundaries and I like raise them, then the boundaries would move up, which would move that entire demand curve up, vertically up, which is not how we usually think of it, but if it's the boundaries, Y value wise, it's going to move it up. If we lower them, it's going to move them down. So let's sort of show you that. Okay, make myself small for this. Shift, this is an expansionary policy shift practice, okay? I'm telling you it's an expansionary policy, okay? I should have had this animated, but What is the expansionary policy tool we use when we're in ample reserves, okay? Limited, I can do everything. Ample, I get narrowed down. I have to do the interest rate ones. So we'll say lowering administered interest rates, just in general, okay, which would be the discount rate and the IOR rate. Okay, those are both administered interest rates. Those are the two that you know about in this class. There are more, but the only ones that this class makes sure that you understand are those two. Okay? Why would we do this? Why would this do what it's supposed to do? Well, if those lines act as the boundaries, the upper and the lower boundaries, they act as the like horizontal portions of the graph. Okay? Then lowering them should decrease kind of everything. So let's show you what that looks like. And this is taken from an FRQ. I took it from their FRQ key for one of the FRQs they made. So here's what this looks like. Pot, it's fine. Okay, we had the initial demand curve, downward sloping weird Z thing in the middle, like weird kind of 2-ish, Z-ish, whatever, zigzag, like that. I have the normal supply curve, ample reserves, so my supply curve is going to be like over here, policy rate, quantity of reserves, and then, my class is like, down, I know. I said the same thing when I saw it the first time. I was like, oh my god, why is it down? But this one's, I think it makes sense why it's down. The upper bound is the discount rate. That got lowered. So this upper boundary will be lower. The lower boundary is the IOR rate. If I'm lowering that, I'm also lowering that lower boundary. So the horizontal portions of this graph are now lower. I'm moving this demand curve zigzaggy thing straight down because my upper and lower boundary on the graph have shifted straight down. Have I changed the amount of money that exists in the economy? Actually, no. Not by enough that would ever matter. Even if I did want to move the supply curve here, it wouldn't change the interest rate. But moving the demand curve does. Because if we lower that IOR rate and that discount rate, the range of possibilities for interest rates have shifted downward, literally. The upper bound is lower. The lower bound is also lower. So banks can charge a lower amount to each other for these loans. They might offer you a lower rate on your deposits, which is not fun. But remember, the point here is to get you to not save your money. The point here is that I should borrow and spend. If this is the policy rate, and the policy rate is indicative of interest rates as a whole, this equilibrium shift from here down to here, from PR1 to PR2, means that interest rates as a whole in this economy should decrease. And if we remember, when you decrease interest rates, and again, the policy rate is an interest rate. When we decrease interest rates, that should lead to higher investment spending and higher aggregate demand. Okay? You could argue that it decreases saving, but hey, if you're not saving your money, what are you doing with it? Spending it, which would also increase aggregate demand. So, just like with the loanable funds market and the money market, I can connect this to the ADAS graph. I do it the same way. It's through that interest rate investment spending relationship. Connected the exact same way. So if I can figure out what's happening to interest rates, then I can figure out what's happening to aggregate demand. Okay? If I lower interest rates, that's higher investment spending, higher AD. If I raise interest rates, it's lower investment spending and it's lower AD, right? So that should still work. If you're wondering how would I draw a contractionary policy here, literally flip the arrows. I would just move the upper and lower bounds up as opposed to down. Okay? If you're wondering, why do they keep it still touching? Kind of up to you, to be honest. This is technically like sliding it down the line. I probably would have drawn it as a full shift downward, but I'm sure it shares. I think they're doing it because like they want to keep that demand curve space, that like space on the supply curve the same. I don't know why they don't do it. I haven't had it explained to me by anybody yet. No one's given me a clear answer on it. So I'm just going to draw it like how they want it because I'd rather do what they do and not get it wrong. So draw it sliding along that line, like that. And now, to be clear, DR, DR1, why they don't label it in their FRQ, I don't know. I don't know why they're not labeling this graph as well. It's really annoying to me. I like labeling the graphs right. Okay. So, here's my summation. I looked over as many questions as I could on AP Classroom they posted, which was quite a few, actually. They do have quite a few questions over this. So, especially the FRQs, because that's where you actually have to draw this graph, okay? Because, like, for multiple choice questions, it actually isn't that bad. It is still just, okay, lower administered interest rates is still expansionary, raising administered interest rates is still contractionary. Okay, so it shouldn't really change my multiple choice answers all that much. On FRQs where you have to draw this, the only shifts I have seen on FRQs, which is a little over a dozen FRQs where I've seen them have you draw the reserve market now, they all are changes in D reserves. They're all shifts like this, where I'm sliding that demand curve up or down. And here's the fun part. They are only changing administered interest rates. They're literally only doing one thing, which is either raising or lowering the discount and IOR rates. They're literally just moving that demand curve up or down. And you just do it based off what the question says. If it says to lower those interest rates, I mean, cool, lower them. If it says to raise them, cool, raise them. Like, it's very straightforward. So as long as you understand that when I lower that I should lower D reserves when they're doing the expansionary, the lower administered interest rates, and increase D reserve when it's contractionary, you should be fine. If it's a limited reserves problem, you can think about it like it's a money market graph. Hell, you could probably draw a money market graph to like solve it. It's just if it asks for the reserve market, you're still solving it like it's a money market problem. If it's ample reserves, that's when I gotta bust out the new graph, because ample reserves is the new thing. It's the new content. It's the new concept. It's the new thing you have to understand. So if I see ample reserves, I gotta do reserve market. If I see limited reserves, money market is fine. Okay. So that is it for the notes. Now, if you want to just take notes, you could stop here. I'm gonna work through an FRQ from AP Classroom that involves this graph because I want you guys to see what I see and how I would solve. Make myself bigger. I'm going to answer the portions of this one by one in this sort of blank space below me, okay? Let me move this little pen thing over here. So what I've got here is a long FRQ. I'm sorry that it's long, but I can honestly sort of stop at C, and that should honestly do it. I'll probably just stop at C. But I want to get to C so that you can sort of understand what I mean when I say this shouldn't actually be that tricky. It's not very different than your money market graph stuff. So let's sort of walk through, okay? Include quick label diagrams if useful or required in explaining your answers. Very nice. A quick label diagram has several axes and curves, clearly labeled and must show directional changes. If the question, that's the arrows in case you're wondering. If the question prompts you to calculate, you must show your work. Okay. Assume that the country's economy is in a short-run equilibrium and that their actual unemployment rate is lower than the natural rate. Let's just solve this like it's a real FRQ. This first part should be review. Okay, the A part is review from Unit 3. So I got actual, let me give my highlighter. Here we go. Actual unemployment rate is lower than the natural rate of unemployment. Okay? Think to yourselves, Mr. McRitchie, what does that do if my actual unemployment rate is lower than my natural rate of unemployment? What should I be thinking when I read that sentence, right? Unemployment rate is lower than it should be, right? Too little unemployment. Weird, right? Like, too much unemployment I know is bad, right? You're like, yeah, lots of unemployment's bad, right? That's a recession. When there's too little unemployment, what's going on? My above, below, at full employment, I should be above it. Like, I have too little unemployment, so I have too much employment. Overemployment, above full employment. Cool. Then I see A and I'm like, I know why they did that now, because A is making me draw this. It says draw your LRAS, SRAS, and AD and label your current price level and output and your full employment output. Gotcha, AP exam. Thank you very much. I can do this. Okay. Draw on the graph. That should do it. Boom. Boom. We can see this? Yes. Okay. We got real GDP as my X, PL as my Y. I'm going to draw my short run equilibrium first because I always like to draw that first. SRAS, AD. It says to label my current price level and current output as PL1 and Y1. My kids might be upset by that because we usually do YE and PLE, but do whatever the exam tells you. They change it sometimes. They vary on this. I'm going to do Y1 and PL1. And then full employment output, which is where my LRAS is. If I'm above full employment, that means that Y1 should be bigger than YF. So YF should be like over here. And that's where my LRAS will go. Like so. So again, this first part is just to have me draw this graph, which, fine. And if you're wondering later on in the graph, in the question, I will go back to this graph and draw a shift on it. I don't do it for A through C, but they just want to know that I know what a positive output gap looks like, basically. Okay. B, assume the economy has ample reserves. No. Highlighter, whoopsie daisy. There we go. Ample reserves. Hello, keyword. What monetary policy, crap, should their central bank use to move the economy toward long-run equilibrium? Okay. Can I do text here? No, I can't. That's annoying. Okay. So, let's make this a little bit smaller so I can write stuff. Okay, so ample reserves, cool, great. I know what's going to happen next. Like, when I see this in a question now, I'm like, okay, are they going to make me do the reserve market? And I'm like, yeah, they are. Okay, monetary policy, okay, it's the Fed, fine. Should they use to get us to long-run equilibrium? Okay, so we need to go to long-run equilibrium. What are they trying to have us do? This is just asking you not which type of monetary policy, that's important, but what monetary policy action should they do? So what type they should do is contractionary. If we're above full employment, we need to slow down, shrink, get back, decrease aggregate demand. Okay, we need to back up effectively. So we need to decrease it. It means we need contractionary policy. The ample reserves thing is going to narrow my answers down. Okay, right? I can't use every monetary policy if it's ample reserves. I can only use 1/2, one sort of general broad thing or two more specific things. The general broad thing is actually what I'm going to use for my answer. Okay, I'm just going to say as my answer here that they should raise. Oh, I'm going to use a black one for this. Raise. Thank you. Increase, which I would write this as a complete sentence, but because I have to use my mouse to write this, I'm not going to do that. Increase administered. I'm just going to write admin interest rates. That would be sufficient. The Federal Reserve or central bank should increase administered interest rates. Period. Done. If you want to have a little more there just to cover your bases because you want to feel real smart, they should increase administered interest rates like the discount rate and the IOR rate in order to return the economy to long-run equilibrium. If it asked you to explain it fully, you would say by raising these interest rates, it will It won't decrease the supply of money, but it will increase the policy rate, thereby increasing overall interest rates and decreasing investment spending due to the higher cost of borrowing, decreasing AD and getting us back to full employment. Like that's the everything. That's not what the question asked though. It just asked what monetary policy should we do. We should do the contractionary one, and if it's ample reserves, that means the interest rate ones. So would they have given you credit if you said raising discount rates specifically or raising IOR rates specifically? I'm actually kind of confident they would. But I can double check it real quick. Scoring guidelines here. Clicking. Scroll down. Look, my graph was right. That's so crazy. I'm so smart. B, it says increase administrative interest rates is what they're looking for. I am confident that they would give you credit if you said the specific ones, discount rate or IOR, because those are correct. Those would work. Those policies are effective there. So I think that would be fine. I want to hide my scoring thing. It won't let me. Okay, that's annoying. Means I'm just not going to draw the graph. Okay, so assume the economy's bank system has ample reserve. Oh no, sorry. C. Draw the reserve market and show how that action affects the policy rate. Okay, this is going to be weird to draw with a mouse. I can already tell this is not going to feel good to draw. So, reserve market. Oh, that's, well, actually, for the axis, that's fine. It's going to get weird. I'm going to make it definitely smaller for this. Okay, we've got quantity of reserves. Capital Q quantity is always allowed. We've got the y-axis, which is what? Well, here's the thing. Does it say? It doesn't say. Wait, here it is. Haha. Almost always in a question that'll give you at least one of the axes just by asking about it. How it affects the policy rate. Oh, what's the y-axis? Oh, it's the policy rate. Yeah, always good to read those questions because they'll tell you, right? It says price level and output on this one. You can use that, right? Policy rate. Cool. Time to draw. The demand curve I'm going to draw first because I always know how that line should work, which is like bing, boom, boom. It's not the best drawing in the world, but it'll work. DR is actually sufficient. And then I'm in ample reserves, so my supply curve should be over here. I am going to just differentiate the color to make it a little easier to see. I'm going to draw these little boundary things. I'm going to label that P, R, E, and Q, R, E for policy rate at equilibrium and quantity of reserves at equilibrium. It doesn't tell me to, but you should always label equilibriums just to be safe. Cool. That's my drawing. Now for my shift, right? We said here to increase administered interest rates, okay? Well, my administered interest rates, again, are the IOR rate and the, oh, I should make this bigger, actually. Make this a little bit, let's make this easier. Make that, there we go. I should definitely make that supply curve bigger. I'm realizing in hindsight how you should draw this, which is more just like for the ease of being able to draw the shift. Yeah, there we go. Give yourself some more room than I did initially. I'm realizing that live. It's like, oh, I should give myself more room. Because if I'm increasing the administered interest rates, and to be clear, these blue dotted lines are the administered interest rates. This one is the discount rate up there. That one is the IOR rate down there. I'm raising those. So I'm going to move my upper and lower boundaries up a smidge. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to move to like here. I'm just going to connect it there like that, because I think that makes sense to me. Increase, DR1, PR1, and I think that's what I would do. In terms of labeling this dotted line thing, I'm not sure how much they want you to actually do that. I know they need you to label this one, because this one is my actual, that's my equilibrium. Sorry, whoopsie days, let me fix that. Here we go, I got used to it. There is my actual equilibrium, right? Where DR1 meets the SR, because there isn't a new supply curve, right? So this is my new equilibrium. I need to label this. I actually don't need to relabel that, because the quantity didn't change, which is cool. So I'll just move the demand curve up, and that should be my answer. I'm going to confirm by looking at the key. Scrolling through. Oh gosh. Sorry, I'm just going to delete that. C. Oh, thank God. I did draw it right. And they do want you to label that. Okay. I assume they would. It just looks weird to do it. So yeah. You increase, there's the big thing, the PR2 there now is what we're labeling it. That's perfectly fine. So we need to make sure we have that. It's 2 points for this, to be clear, which 1 point is for making sure that supply curve intersects the demand curve in the range of ample reserves. So the first point you get is for making sure that supply curve is over here and not through here, okay? Second points you get is by shifting this demand curve up. An increase in administered interest rates, which increases the policy rate. So it gives you that higher demand curve going up. Okay, so there's the rest of this is fine, but is not essential. That stuff's mostly reviewed from previous units. Don't really need that to solve the rest of this. Okay, so let's just go back to just me for the rest of this then. So this is just the wrap up. So the reserve market is a new graph. It's a weird looking graph. It's for sure visually weird. But in terms of how much do I have to do with this, Mr. McRitchie? Thankfully, like one thing really, which is I need to know that I can shift the demand curve up or down if they raise or lower the administered interest rates. I need to I don't need to get why necessarily. It's good to, but I just need to understand that upper bound is the discount rate, the lower bound is the IOR rate. So when they increase the administered interest rates, I'm just going to move those bounds up, which will move that entire demand curve up. And if I lower them, I'm going to move those bounds down, which will move the entire demand curve down. The supply curve, I just got to know where I start it. Do I draw it over on the right side, where we're in the bottom part, or do I draw it in the downward sloping portion? And that's just based if it's ample, I'm in the horizontal thing. If it's limited, I'm in the normal downward sloping demand portion. Cool? Longer video, I know. First time doing it, and the last 10 minutes was really just an FRQ, so that was mostly just a one class lecture, I think. But, guy, I know. It's a spooky graph. It's fair game for the exam, though. It is fair game for the AP exam. In fact, I would kind of expect it. The way they've emphasized it got me a bit concerned that this thing could for sure show up. Again, shift-wise, not the hardest thing in the world. Make sure you know how to draw it. That is probably the weirdest part, is just drawing it. But the shifts were actually not the craziest thing to deal with. Cool? But thank you guys for watching. As always, I greatly appreciate it. If you want to leave a like, feel free to. If you watch my channel a bunch, feel free to subscribe. I don't have this thing monetized, but, you know, it's nice to have people like it and subscribe because it makes these videos show up on searches much easier so people can get help faster. So if you feel the need to, go for it. Thank you as always. And I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Appreciate it.